The afternoon sun painted the sky of Bethlehem with orange hues when Father Michael felt the first sharp pain in his chest. At 45, he had never imagined that this Thursday afternoon would forever change his understanding of God and the meaning of divine love. In the sacristy of the small St. Benedict Church, he was preparing for the evening Mass when the sharp pain made him stagger. "Father Michael, are you okay?" The concerned voice of Mrs. Cecilia, the devoted parish secretary, seemed to come from far away. The priest tried to respond, but the words wouldn't come out. The pain intensified, spreading through his left arm like burning embers. Within minutes, the world around him began to darken. The saints on the walls seemed to watch him with compassionate eyes as he slid to the floor. The rosary in his hands slipped, the wooden beads scattering across the marble floor like silent tears. "Help! Someone call an ambulance!" Mrs. Cecilia's desperate cry echoed through the empty church, reverberating among the stained glass windows that now seemed distant and blurred. And then it happened. As his body lay on the cold sacristy floor, Michael felt himself floating. The pain disappeared completely, replaced by an indescribable sense of lightness. He saw himself hovering above his own body, watching the frantic activity forming around him. Mrs. Cecilia wept, holding his lifeless hand, while other parishioners rushed to help. But that was only the beginning. A tunnel of light opened before him, not above as he had so often heard described, but all around him, enveloping him in every direction. The light was not blinding, but welcoming, like a long-forgotten maternal embrace. And with it came a presence, a consciousness so vast and loving that his words could never adequately describe it. "Michael, my son." The voice was not a voice in the common sense, but a vibration that resonated in every particle of his being. "There is so much you still do not understand about my love." In that moment, cascades of understanding flooded his consciousness. He saw the universe in its infinite magnitude, billions of galaxies dancing a cosmic waltz. He saw Earth small and precious, a grain of sand in the ocean of the cosmos. And he saw the people, all of them, interconnected by threads of golden light, each carrying a spark of the same divine essence. "But Lord," Michael tried to argue, his theological convictions from 2 decades of priesthood emerging, "what about the sinners, those who stray from the path?" The answer came not in words, but in an explosion of love so profound that it made him sob. He saw that every soul, regardless of their choices or beliefs, was immersed in the same ocean of divine love. The different religions, which he had always seen as dividing walls, appeared as different windows of the same infinite palace, each offering its own perspective of the same eternal light. "Your judgments are like walls you have built yourself," the presence continued, "but my love knows no barriers. Each of my children, every creature carries my essence. The love you have preached until now is but a drop in the ocean of what I truly am." Michael saw his own sermons, the times he had used the pulpit to condemn rather than to welcome. Every harsh word he had spoken came back to him, not as condemnation, but as an opportunity for growth. He realized that his narrow interpretation of faith had not only limited his own understanding of the divine, but had also pushed away those who were thirsty for spiritual connection. Amid this revelation, he felt himself being pulled back. The tunnel of light began to fade, but the divine presence left one final message. "Take this truth to others, Michael. Not through imposition, but with the same love you now experience. Everyone has their own time and path." The return was abrupt. The pain came back like a wave, but this time less intense. He opened his eyes to find himself in a moving ambulance, paramedics working quickly around him. Tears streamed down his face, but they were not from physical pain. Something fundamental had shifted within him. "He's coming back," one of the paramedics exclaimed. "Father, can you hear me?" Michael simply smiled, feeling the weight and joy of the mission he had just received. His life, he knew, would never be the same. The heart attack that had nearly killed him had paradoxically given him a new birth. Now he needed to find a way to share this new understanding with his community, even knowing that not everyone would be ready to receive it. The days in the hospital passed in a blur of tests, medications, and worried visits. "Helen, his wife, of 15 years, rarely left his side, her brown eyes alternating between relief and concern. As a catechism teacher and the daughter of a traditional pastor, she had dedicated her life to the same rigorous interpretation of faith that Michael now questioned. "The doctors say it was a miracle," Helen remarked one afternoon, holding his hand tenderly. "They say your heart stopped for almost 5 minutes." Michael gently squeezed his wife's hand, knowing he needed to share his experience but fearing the consequences. "Helen, something happened during those minutes. Something that changed everything." She leaned forward, her dark curls framing her attentive face. "What do you mean, Michael?" With a voice choked with emotion, he began to recount his experience. He spoke of the tunnel of light, the divine presence, the revelations, about God's universal love. As he spoke, he noticed Helen's eyebrows gradually furrowing. "Are you saying that all religions are valid?" Her voice trembled slightly. "That it doesn't matter what people believe?" "I'm saying that God's love is greater than any religion. Helen, greater than our limited understanding." He tried to explain, feeling the chasm beginning to open between them. "I realize that our doctrines are like maps trying to describe an infinite territory." Helen stood up abruptly, letting go of his hand. "Michael, you've been through intense trauma. Perhaps these visions are a result of your altered state. Or even," she hesitated, "an evil influence trying to confuse your faith." "No, my love." He tried to reach for her, but she stepped away. "It was the most real and sacred experience of my life. I need to share this message. You are a Catholic priest." Her voice rose an octave. "You have responsibilities, a flock to guide. You can't just start preaching to heresies." The word heresies fell between them like a heavy stone. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the challenge ahead. It wasn't just his wife who would react this way. He knew his congregation, his superiors. Everyone would struggle to accept his new understanding. In the following days, the visits multiplied. Bishop Fernando came personally, bringing words of comfort and guidance about the recovery period. Michael observed everyone with new eyes, seeing beyond appearances and titles, perceiving the divine, light that dwelled within each one. During a particularly quiet afternoon, he received a visit from Father John, an old friend from the seminary who served in a neighboring parish. Unlike the others, John seemed to notice something different in his gaze. "You've changed, Michael," he remarked, studying his face. "It's not just the heart attack, there's something more." He was the first person with whom Michael felt he could be completely honest. He shared his experience without reservation, noticing how his friend listened attentively without judgment. "You know," John said after a long silence, "St. John of the Cross spoke about the dark night of the soul, that moment when our certainties crumble, to make way for a deeper understanding. Perhaps you're going through something like that." "But how can I continue my ministry knowing what I know now?" Michael asked, expressing his deepest anguish. "How can I preach something different from what I've always taught?" John smiled gently. "Maybe that's exactly why you went through all of this. Sometimes we need to lose our certainties to find a greater truth." The conversation with John brought some comfort, but the worries persisted. Helen was growing increasingly distant, sleeping in the guest room since he had returned home. The visits from the parishioners, though well-meaning, only increased his anxiety about returning to the pulpit. One night, unable to sleep, Michael walked to the small garden of his parochial house. The starry sky reminded him of the vision, of the universe during his experience. There, under the stars, he began to form a plan. He couldn't deny his truth, but he would need to find a gentle way to share it. He would start slowly, planting seeds of a broader understanding of divine love. "Lord," he whispered into the night, "grant me the wisdom to share your love without creating further divisions." A gentle breeze brushed his face, carrying with it the scent of the night-blooming jasmine that Helen had planted years ago. He realized that his journey was just beginning, and that each step would require courage, compassion, and above all, love. The Sunday of his return to the church dawned with a crystal blue sky. Michael woke early, spending long moments in silent prayer in his office. The words of the sermon he had prepared seemed to pulse in his mind, each one carefully chosen to initiate a gentle transition. The Church of St. Benedict was packed. News of his heart attack and miraculous recovery had spread through the small town, drawing even those who rarely attended Mass. Michael observed the familiar faces as he walked. Down the central aisle, Mrs. Cecilia still visibly emotional, the group of young people he mentored, and Helen seated in the front row, her face a mask of controlled concern. "Brothers and sisters," he began, his voice softer than usual, "during my recovery, I reflected deeply on the love of God. Today, I would like to share something that has transformed my understanding of that love." In the pews, people shifted, attentive. Michael continued, "Often we try to place divine love in boxes to define its rules and boundaries. But how can we limit something that is infinite? How can we say that God's love reaches only those who follow a certain path?" He saw some eyebrows rise, confused expressions beginning to form. Helen shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Jesus taught us that we must love our enemies, bless those who persecute us. Why? Because every human being, regardless of their choices or beliefs, carries the divine spark within them. Each one is a beloved child of God." The murmur started, low, gradually growing like a wave. Michael saw Mr. George, the prayer group coordinator, whispering with other members. Mrs. Marcia, known for her traditionalist stance, had her lips pressed tightly in clear disapproval. But he also noticed other faces. Claire, a young woman who had distanced herself from the church after conflicts over her sexual orientation, had tears in her eyes. Mr. Joseph, whose son had converted to another religion, causing a painful family rift, was listening with renewed attention. "The love I experienced," Michael hesitated, considering whether he should share his full experience. He decided it wasn't the right moment yet. "The love that God offers us is like an infinite ocean. Our different ways of seeking the divine are like rivers that flow into the same ocean." After the Mass, the reactions were immediate. A small group formed around him, some with questions, others with concerns. Mrs. Marcia was the first to speak up. "Father, are you suggesting that it doesn't matter what people believe? That all religions are the same?" "No, Mrs. Marcia," he replied patiently. "I'm saying that God's love is greater than our divisions, that perhaps we need to be more humble in our certainties." Claire approached timidly. "Father Michael, your words, they gave me hope. For so long I felt excluded, as if God couldn't love me as I am." Michael's heart warmed at those words, but before he could respond, Mr. George intervened. "Father, with all due respect, but this sounds like relativism. The Church has clear doctrines, established truths. We can't simply ignore them." Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "George, doctrines are important. They are like signposts on our spiritual journey. But we must not confuse the signs with the destination. The destination is love." The murmuring grew louder. Helen had already left the church, and Michael could feel the emptiness of her absence. Some more traditionalist parishioners followed her example, while others remained, intrigued by this new perspective. That night, alone in his office, Michael wrote in his journal, trying to process the day's events. The phone rang several times. He knew it was members of the pastoral council, likely concerned about the direction he was taking. But at that moment, he needed silence to listen to his own soul. "My God," he whispered to the crucifix on the wall, "give me the strength to remain faithful to the truth you have shown me, even when the path seems lonely." The following weeks brought profound changes to St. Benedict's parish. The number of attendees at Mass decreased, especially among the more traditionalists. On the other hand, people who had long been distant from the church began to return, drawn by the message of inclusive love that Michael was now preaching. Helen continued to live in the parish house, but the silence between them grew like an invisible wall. One particularly tense morning, she finally voiced her fears. "Michael, do you realize you're destroying everything we've built? Our parish is splitting. People are confused, even our marriage." He approached her in the kitchen, his heart heavy as he saw the tears she was trying to hold back. "Helen, what I experienced doesn't contradict our faith. It expands it. The love I saw—" "Stop!" She raised her hands in defense. "You keep talking about this experience as if it were more important than 2,000 years of church tradition. What if it's just your mind playing tricks on you? What if it's true? Michael added softly. What if God is calling us to a deeper understanding? Helen shook her head, picking up her bag. I'm going to spend a few days at my parents' house. I need to think, Michael. I need to figure out if there's still a place for me in this new version of faith you're talking about. The sound of the door closing echoed through the empty house. Michael sat at the kitchen table, staring at the half-finished cup of coffee Helen had left behind. He remembered how they had met 15 years ago, when he was still a young, newly ordained priest, and she was a devoted catechist. Their love had blossomed naturally, with the church's special blessing for their marriage, a rare but possible exception in their diocese. That afternoon he received a visit from Bishop Fernando. The meeting was cordial, but the concerns were evident. My son, the bishop began, his aged hands clasped on the table. I've been receiving many calls. People are worried about the direction of your homilies, about some of the statements you've been making. Bishop Fernando, do you believe God could surprise us with a revelation greater than what we already know? The bishop smiled paternally. God always surprises us, Michael, but he also gave us the church as the guardian of truth. We must be careful not to confuse our personal experiences with established doctrine. But what if our doctrines are just our limited attempt to understand something much greater? Bishop Fernando sighed deeply. Michael, you have always been one of my best priests. Your dedication to the flock is admirable, but I must ask you to be prudent. Give yourself time to process your experience. I don't want to have to take more serious measures. The veiled warning was clear. Michael could face suspension or even lose his parish if he continued down this path. But how could he deny what he knew to be true? That night he found refuge in his garden once again. Helen's night-blooming jasmine filled the air with its fragrance, reminding him of everything at stake. It was then that he noticed a figure standing at the gate, Claire, the young woman who had spoken up after his first homily. Father Michael, I'm sorry to come so late, but I need to talk. He invited her in, prepared some tea, and listened to her story. Claire spoke about years of suffering, trying to deny her identity to fit the church's standards, about attempts at healing that only brought more pain, about the moment she decided to distance herself from God because she believed he rejected her. Your words about God's infinite love, it was the first time I felt like I could be who I am and still be loved by him. She wiped away her tears. Other young people like me are returning to seek God because of your message. Michael felt a growing certainty in his heart. Even if he lost everything, his ministry, his marriage, his position, he couldn't deny this truth. The love he had experienced was too great to be confined by narrow dogmas. Claire, he said gently, you were never separated from God's love, not even for a second. When she left, Michael stayed awake, reflecting. The bishop's words, Helen's absence, the divisions in the parish, it all weighed heavily on his shoulders. But there were also the stories of healing and reconciliation that were beginning to emerge. People rediscovering a faith that didn't require them to deny their essence. It's not easy, is it? The familiar voice of his friend Father John surprised him. He had arrived quietly in the garden. How did you know I'd be here? John smiled. Where else would a man torn between heaven and earth be on a night like this? John sat beside Michael on the small garden bench, the night air heavy with the scent of flowers and the weight of unanswered questions. For a few moments both remained silent, gazing at the stars that dotted the sky of Bethlehem. Do you know, John began, his calm voice breaking the stillness of the night, when you told me about your experience at the hospital, I remembered something I read about Teilhard de Chardin. He spoke of how the entire universe is interconnected by invisible threads of divine love. Michael smiled, recognizing the reference to the controversial Jesuit theologian. He was also misunderstood in his time, wasn't he? Accused of heresy for trying to reconcile science and faith. And today, he is considered a visionary by many, John added. Times change, Michael. The truths that frighten one generation may be accepted in the next. The conversation was interrupted by a sound coming from the house. It was Michael's cell phone ringing insistently. On the screen, Helen's name flashed like a painful reminder of everything at stake. Aren't you going to answer? John, asked softly. Michael shook his head. Not yet. I need to find the right words. Sometimes there are no right words, my friend. Only truths that need to be lived. That night after John left, Michael finally returned Helen's call. The conversation was difficult, filled with long silences and restrained tears. I spoke with my father, she said, her voice trembling over the phone. He thinks you're under the influence of deceiving spirits. He wants to organize a deliverance session. Michael closed his eyes, feeling the weight of those words. Helen, what I experienced was the opposite of any deception. It was the purest truth I've ever known. How can you be so sure? The enemy can disguise himself as an angel of light. You've always taught that yourself. Because the fruit of all this is love, Helen. Not fear, not condemnation, but pure and expansive love. People are reconnecting with God in a deeper way. The silence on the other end of the line was long. When Helen spoke again, her voice was different, more resolute. I need more time, Michael. Please don't try to look for me for now. The following days brought new challenges. The traditionalist prayer group, led by Mr. George, began meeting in private homes, refusing to attend Michael's masses. On the other hand, a spontaneous movement started to emerge among the young people of the parish. They created a study group, exploring texts from mystics and saints who spoke about the universality of divine love. Claire, who was now actively involved in the community, organized a special gathering for people who, like her, had drifted away from the church because they felt excluded. The parish hall was packed that evening. Father Michael, a young man, stood up during the meeting, his hands trembling slightly. I always believed that God hated me for who I am. I went through healing therapies, fasts, exorcisms, but for the first time I feel like I can be loved by God exactly as I am. Similar stories multiplied. People shared experiences of rejection, pain, and now renewed hope. Michael watched, it all with a mix of joy and apprehension, aware that each step in this direction took him further away from the traditional structures of the church. One afternoon, as he was organizing some documents in his office, he received an unexpected visit. It was Mrs. Marcia, one of the people who had most opposed his new message. Father, she began hesitantly, I came because, well, my granddaughter attempted suicide last week. Her voice faltered. She left a letter saying she couldn't bear living in hiding anymore, that God would never accept her. Michael felt his heart tighten. Is she okay? Yes, we got there in time, but... Mrs. Marcia wiped away a tear. Your words about God's unconditional love, perhaps that's what she needs to hear right now. That moment with Mrs. Marcia represented a small but significant shift. It was as if the invisible bonds John had mentioned were beginning to reveal themselves, connecting stories and hearts in unexpected ways. The news about Mrs. Marcia's granddaughter's suicide attempt spread quickly through the small community of Bethlehem, provoking different reactions. For some, it was a sign of the moral decay that Father Michael's new ideas were bringing. For others, it was a painful awakening to the need for a more loving and inclusive approach to faith. On a particularly humid morning, Michael found an official letter from the diocese on his desk. His heart raced as he recognized the episcopal seal. Inside was a formal notice requesting his presence at a meeting with the diocesan council the following week. They're going to try to silence you, Father John remarked when Michael showed him the letter during one of their nightly meetings in the garden. You know that, don't you? Michael nodded, fiddling with the rosary between his fingers. I can't turn back, John. Not after everything I've seen, everything I've experienced. And you shouldn't, his friend replied, surprising him. You know, I've been observing the changes in your parish. Yes, some have drifted away, but others are finding genuine healing, Michael, a real reconnection with the divine. At that moment, they were interrupted by a commotion coming from the street. It was a group of young people from the parish, led by Claire, carrying signs and banners. We stand with you, Father Michael. God's love is for everyone. The handwritten messages glowed under the streetlights. What's going on? Michael asked, walking toward the gate. Claire, her eyes shining with determination, explained, We heard about the meeting with the council. We're organizing a prayer. Vigil. We won't let them silence you." The news of the vigil spread quickly on social media. In the following days, people from different religious denominations, and even those without religion, began arriving in Bethlehem. They set up tents in the square in front of the church, sharing stories, prayers, and songs. Helen watched everything from a distance, her heart torn between love for her husband and her own deeply rooted convictions. One night, unable to bear the internal conflict any longer, she decided to discreetly join the vigil. What she witnessed left her speechless. She saw Catholics and Protestants praying together. She saw people whom society often marginalized being welcomed with genuine love. She saw tears of healing and reconciliation. In one corner of the square, Mrs. Marcia embraced her granddaughter, both crying and smiling at the same time. "It's different when you really look, isn't it?" Michael's gentle voice surprised her. He had approached without her noticing. Helen hesitated, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I'm so afraid, Michael. Afraid of being wrong, afraid of being right, afraid of losing everything I've always believed in." Michael gently touched her arm. "God's love doesn't ask us to lose anything, Helen, only to expand our hearts." Before they could continue the conversation, they were interrupted by a commotion. A group led by Mr. George had arrived, carrying signs with messages of condemnation. "Heresy! False prophet!" The shouts cut through the night like knives. The tension was palpable. Some of the young people from the vigil began to rise, ready to confront the protesters, but Michael quickly intervened. "Remember what we have learned." His calm but firm voice rose above the chaos. "Love does not respond to hate with hate. They are also our brothers." To everyone's surprise, Claire began to sing. It was an ancient hymn of praise that spoke of God's love. Gradually, other voices joined hers. The sound grew, filling the square with a harmony that seemed to come from another world. Mr. George and his group were taken aback. They had not expected to be met with music and smiles. Some lowered their signs, others quietly stepped away. That night, something subtly shifted in the atmosphere of Bethlehem. It was as if the echoes of the truth Michael had experienced in his near-death encounter began to resonate in the hearts of more and more people. The day of the meeting with the diocesan council dawned with a fine, persistent drizzle. Michael woke before sunrise, spending long hours in silent prayer. In the square, dozens of people from the vigil remained steadfast, their tents soaked but their voices strong in prayer. The headquarters of the diocese was 2 hours away from Bethlehem. Helen, surprising everyone, offered to drive. During the trip, the silence between them was different, no longer filled with tension but with a mutual understanding that was beginning to blossom. "Whatever the outcome," she finally said, breaking the silence, "I want you to know that I'm starting to understand. I don't agree with everything, but I see the love of God working through you." Michael felt tears forming in his eyes. It was the first time since his experience that Helen had shown any openness to his new understanding. The diocesan building was an imposing 19th century structure, its stone walls exuding authority and tradition. In the waiting room, Michael found Father John, who had made it a point to be there as his supporter. "Remember," John whispered, "you're not alone in this." The council chamber was circular, with a large crucifix dominating the main wall. 12 people awaited him: Bishop Fernando, 5 priests from the council, 3 theologians, and 3 lay representatives of the diocese. "Father Michael," Bishop Fernando began, his deep voice echoing through the room, "we are here to discuss serious concerns regarding your recent pastoral conduct. We have reports of statements that directly contradict the Church's magisterium." For 2 hours, Michael was questioned about his homilies, his pastoral actions, and especially his near-death experience. The council members alternated between genuine curiosity and clear disapproval. "Are you aware that your words about other religions border on doctrinal relativism?" asked one of the theologians. "With all due respect," Michael replied calmly, "what I experienced was not relativism, but an expansion of the truth. I saw that God's love is greater than our doctrinal definitions." "And what about the faithful who are confused and scandalized?" another counselor questioned. we have reports of entire families leaving their parish. It's true, Michael admitted. But we also have people returning to the church, finding healing and reconciliation with God. People who previously felt excluded from divine love. The questioning continued, growing increasingly intense. It was then that a lay counselor, who had remained silent until then, intervened. "My daughter was at the vigil last night," she said, her voice choked. "She left the church years ago after embracing her identity. Yesterday she called me crying, saying that for the first time in a long time, she felt that God truly loved her." A heavy silence fell over the room. Bishop Fernando adjusted his glasses, visibly moved by the testimony. "Father Michael," he finally said, "no one here doubts your sincerity or your love for the faithful. But the church has a responsibility to preserve the revealed truth. We need time to discern how to proceed." The council's decision was announced after an hour of deliberation. Michael would be temporarily relieved of his pastoral duties for a period of reflection and discernment. He could not celebrate public masses or make statements on behalf of the church until further notice. As he left the council room, Michael found Helen and John waiting for him. On his wife's face was a determination he hadn't seen in weeks. "We'll keep going," she said, surprising him. "Not in the church, but in our home. People need to hear this message of love." John smiled. "Maybe this separation is exactly what needed to happen. Now you can share the truth without institutional limitations." On the way back to Bethlehem, Michael reflected on how God worked in mysterious ways. What seemed like a punishment might actually be a liberation. The news of Michael's suspension spread quickly through Bethlehem, sparking a wave of emotion and solidarity. The morning after his return, dozens of people gathered in front of his house, bringing flowers, signs of support, and most importantly, stories of how his message had transformed their lives. Helen, in a surprising show of support, opened the doors of their home to everyone. The garden, once her solitary refuge, became a space for gathering and healing. The night-blooming jasmine, now in full bloom, silently witnessed the changes taking place. "I never imagined our home would become a center for spiritual renewal," Helen remarked one evening as she helped arrange chairs for another gathering. "It's as if God is showing us that His presence isn't limited to buildings or institutions." Michael watched amazed as his wife blossomed in her own process of transformation. She still held on to much of her traditional faith, but now expressed it with a new openness and understanding. The gatherings at the Thompson household, as they came to be known, quickly became a local phenomenon. People from different religious denominations, and even those without religion, came to share their stories and seek understanding. There was no formal liturgy, just sincere conversations about spirituality, divine love, and personal transformation. Claire, who had naturally emerged as a leader in the movement, organized a support system for people in emotional and spiritual vulnerability. "Many of us carry deep wounds inflicted in the name of religion," she explained. "We need a safe space to heal those wounds." Even Mr. George, who had led the opposition to Michael, showed up at one of the gatherings. He sat quietly in the back of the garden, observing. At the end of the evening, he approached Michael with tears in his eyes. Michael," he began hesitantly. "My youngest son, he came out as gay 3 years ago. I haven't spoken to him since. I thought I was defending God's truth, but after hearing all these stories, and was it me who strayed from true divine love?" Michael embraced the older man, feeling the walls of fear and prejudice begin to crumble before the transformative power of unconditional love. Bishop Fernando also made a discreet visit, arriving unannounced on a rainy afternoon. He observed the sharing groups, the spontaneous prayers, the tears of healing, and the smiles of acceptance. "You know, Michael," he commented before leaving, "when the Spirit blows, our structures sometimes need to adapt. Continue your work, keep me informed." The months passed, and the movement grew organically. People from neighboring towns began to create similar groups, always maintaining the spirit of inclusion and unconditional love. Michael and Helen occasionally traveled to share their experience, but they made a point to emphasize that each community should find its own path. On a particularly special evening, as the garden was filled with people sharing stories and songs, Helen approached Michael with a mysterious smile. Remember when you told me about your experience, about how you saw all the people connected by threads of golden light? Michael nodded, curious. Look around us now, she whispered, gesturing to the garden illuminated by lanterns. Isn't this exactly what's happening? Different people, different stories, all connected by the same divine love? A year had passed since the heart attack that had changed Michael's life. The small town of Bethlehem, known for its traditional, religious devotion, had witnessed a quiet but profound transformation. The gatherings at the Thompsons' home had become a beacon of hope for people from all over America. On a Sunday afternoon, as they prepared the garden for another gathering, Michael and Helen received unexpected news. The Pope had appointed a special envoy to learn about the work they were doing. The news caused a mix of apprehension and hope in the community. What if they try to stop us from continuing? Claire voiced the concern that many shared. Then we will continue in another way, Helen replied, with a serenity that surprised everyone. What happens here is greater than any institution. The envoy from the Vatican, Father Joseph Martini, was an Italian Jesuit with kind eyes and a gentle smile. He arrived without pomp or ceremony, wearing a simple black cassock and carrying only a small suitcase. I came to observe and learn, he explained in fluent Portuguese, not to judge. For a week, Father Joseph participated in the gatherings, talked with the people, and listened to their stories. He observed how Catholics, Protestants, Spiritists, and people without a defined religion shared their experiences in harmony. One particularly eventful night, he witnessed something extraordinary. Mr. George had brought his son after 3 years of separation. The reunion between father and son, marked by tears of repentance and forgiveness, touched everyone present. So do you know what impresses me the most? Father Joseph commented to Michael as they watched the scene. It's not the grand gestures or the dramatic stories. It's how divine love manifests in the small things, in the exchanged glances, the hesitant smiles, the hands that meet after so long apart. On the last night of his visit, during one of the most well-attended gatherings ever held in the Thompsons' garden, Father Joseph asked to speak. I came to Bethlehem expecting to find a controversial movement, he began, his soft voice carrying a weight of authority. Instead, I found something that the early church knew well: different people united by the love of Christ, sharing their lives with simplicity and authenticity. He paused, his eyes scanning the attentive faces. The church, in its wisdom, has always known that the Holy Spirit blows where it wills. Sometimes, we need the humility to recognize that God is doing something new, something that challenges our traditional structures, but remains faithful to the essence of the gospel. Father Joseph Martini's statement was met with silent tears of gratitude. It was as if an invisible weight had been lifted from everyone's shoulders. After most people had left, Michael found Helen sitting alone in the garden, gazing at the stars. What are you thinking about? He asked, sitting down beside her. About how God works in mysterious ways, she smiled. Your heart attack almost made me lose you, but it also brought us to a deeper understanding of divine love. Our losses have turned into greater gains than we could have imagined. Michael took her hand, feeling the ring that symbolized not only their marital love, but now also their spiritual partnership. You know what moves me the most, Helen continued, seeing how everyone who comes here ends up becoming a little more aware of that light that unites us. It's as if each person carries a spark of that love back to their own circles. 18 months after the heart attack that had transformed his life, Michael was once again in the sacristy of St. Benedict's Church. This time, not to celebrate a traditional mass, but to participate in a historic event, an ecumenical gathering of reconciliation and celebration of divine love. The church looked different. The pews had been rearranged in concentric circles, symbolizing equality and unity in diversity. Representatives from various religious denominations occupied the sacred space, no longer as doctrinal adversaries, but as brothers and sisters united by the same love. Bishop Fernando presided over the gathering, his official presence symbolizing a new era of dialogue and understanding. Beside him, Protestant, Spiritist, and other spiritual leaders shared the altar in harmony. 2 years ago, Michael began his testimony, I had an experience that completely changed my understanding of divine love. I thought I was losing everything, my ministry, my marriage, my certainties. But God was only preparing me for something greater. Helen, seated in the front row, smiled through her tears. Beside her, Claire held her partner's hand, their rings glinting under the light streaming through the stained glass windows. Mr. George and his son were nearby, slowly rebuilding the family bonds that prejudice had broken. What happened in our community was not a doctrinal revolution, Michael continued, but an awakening to the true essence of divine love, a love that does not exclude, does not judge, does not impose conditions, a love that simply embraces, accepts, and transforms. The night-blooming jasmine from the Thompsons' garden had been brought into the church, its delicate fragrance permeating the space as a reminder of the nights of healing and reconciliation they had witnessed. Our home became a meeting place. Helen spoke up, her voice steady yet emotional. But the real transformation happened in our hearts. Every story shared, every tear shed, every embrace exchanged was a living testimony to God's unconditional love. Bishop Fernando then stood, his serene expression revealing a deep conviction. The church has always been called to be a field hospital for the wounded, as the Pope reminds us. What we have witnessed here in Bethlehem is a living example of that mission. The bishop then announced that the gatherings at the Thompson household would be officially recognized as a special ministry of the diocese, a space of welcome and spiritual renewal. More importantly, Michael would be reinstated into the priestly ministry with the specific mission of promoting dialogue and reconciliation. Father John, who had been a constant support throughout the journey, led a final prayer that united all the voices present. May the love that binds us be greater than all that divides us. May the light that Michael saw in his experience continue to shine through each of us. As the celebration came to an end, Michael once again felt that loving presence he had encountered during his near-death experience. But now, he was not alone in his perception. Looking around, he saw reflections of that divine light in every face, in every smile, in every tear of gratitude. In the church garden after the ceremony, people from different backgrounds and beliefs shared stories and embraces. The barriers that once seemed insurmountable had dissolved in the recognition of a deeper truth. Divine love transcends all our definitions and limitations. Helen approached Michael, intertwining her fingers with his. "Do you know what I've learned through this whole journey?" she whispered. "That sometimes we need to die to our certainties to be reborn into a greater truth." Michael smiled, gazing at the evening sky. The first stars were beginning to appear, reminding him of the golden threads of light he had seen connecting all souls. Now that vision was no longer just a memory from his near-death experience, but a living reality that manifested daily in the transformed community of Bethlehem. "Love," he replied softly, "is always greater." And that night, as the night-blooming jasmine released its fragrance in the church garden, the small town of Bethlehem witnessed not just the end of a story, but the continuous unfolding of a love that transcends all barriers, uniting hearts and transforming lives in its eternal dance of light and grace.